Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for CRA 101 Banks and Nonprofits Teaming Up for Community Change. I'm Sharon Taylor, a member of the ABEP Financial Empowerment Center Task Force, and I'm honored to welcome you today. Before we begin, we want to recognize and thank our sponsor, Old National Bank, for making this session possible and for their commitment to community education. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Greg Wilson from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition.
Thank you very much, Sharon. My name's Greg Wilson. I'm senior organizer for NCRC, and I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. Um, we're going to have several speakers, but first I want to thank Deborah Hurston from ABEP for inviting us to present with you all. This is a version of a CRA 101 that we gave in Northern Indiana that Deborah witnessed, and she said, Greg, can we have this in Minneapolis and St. Paul? I believe my colleagues will really benefit by seeing it. So we put this together, and we hope that you'll learn a lot from it. This is our CRA 101. Our speakers today will be Nzinga Killebrew, our CRA specialist, Jason Richardson, our research director, and Catherine Petrus, our director of institutional accountability. Before we move any further, I just want to make note that at the end of their presentation, we'll have a short Q&A. And if you look at the bottom of the screen here, you'll see a little Q&A box. If you could put your questions in the Q&A box, we'll be sure to answer them. And before we start, I'd like to just give this disclaimer that this content is the property of NCRC. It's not vetted by any financial institution or corporate sponsor. We look forward to sharing our information with you all because we believe that the Community Reinvestment Act is really important and that folks that understand the law can actively engage with their financial services institutions and get some reinvestment back in their community. So to get things started, I'd like to start with Nzinga Killebrew. Nzinga, it's all you.
Welcome to CRA 101. My name is Nzinga Killebrew, and I am a CRA specialist at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And today I will give you a brief rundown of the history of the CRA and what it entails. So today we're going to discuss three topics: the history of the Community Reinvestment Act, the Minneapolis and St. Paul overview, and then we're going to also discuss your role and involvement in the CRA. So as some background, banks play a critical role in a just economy, and an underlying principle behind CRA is that you can't have justice without economic justice, and you can't have economic justice without access to safe and affordable capital. So, unfortunately, banks don't always stay true to their public purpose and their obligations. Like many laws, the CRA was a response to a practice in banking called redlining. Redlining was a decades-long practice of refusing to make loans in certain communities based on class, race, immigrant status of their residents. Redlining started during the Great Depression and with the formation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation would send employees to cities around the country. They would draw up maps and then they would color code different census tracts. And if you lived in an area that was coded red, it was deemed hazardous and you could not get a loan in that area. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, used the same logic in their systems for appraisals. The result has been a decades-long disinvestment in certain communities. So turning to the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act was one of four civil rights laws aiming to end redlining and housing discrimination. It influences modern bank lending policy and fosters a practice of accountability in how banks service their communities. So the first of those laws was the Fair Housing Act. That was enacted in 1968. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination. This includes practices like refusing to rent or sell homes to certain ethnicities, religions, and other protected classes under the law. This also prevents charging different fees or rents based on this criteria. So then in 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was enacted, which also prohibits discrimination in all credit lending. And then in 1975, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which people refer to as HMDA, required banks to collect and disclose data about the ethnicity and race of their mortgage applicants. And then finally, in 1977, the CRA was passed. And the CRA is the only one of these laws that carries with it an affirmative obligation. Again, this requires banks to serve the entire communities in which the markets where they're located. CRA banks serve their requires the banks to serve the convenience and needs of the communities where they're located. So later on, the Financial Institutions Reform Recovery Act for FIRREA of 1989 was a significant change to the CRA. Specifically, FIRREA required regulatory agencies to publicly post CRA ratings. This increased transparency by making the performance ratings of financial institutions available to the public. Conduct written performance evaluation were based on facts, data, enhancing accountability, and this enhanced the financial institutions' community reinvestment efforts where they were documented. Um, Before that, from between 1977 and 89, the CRA ratings were not public. So in 1995, we had some new CRA regulations. Um, these are the CRA performance regulations that we're under to this day. This is the rule we're under now. What is not in the CRA though is that the CRA is colorblind. So even though it's an anti-redlining law, there's no specific reference to race. Also, this is an aside, CRA does not apply to credit unions. This is our current comptroller as of July 2025. Jonathan Gould is now the head of the OCC. We will still probably be operating under the 1995 rule for the near future. In 2023, we had a modernization rule, but this rule has been terminated under the current administration. Unfortunately, redlining is not a thing of the past. The impact of redlining continues in practice. And in 2021, the Justice Department announced an initiative to combat redlining. And if you look online, you can find several redlining settlements. DOJ ended their redlining combat initiative in 2025, and they have filed motions to dismiss redlining consent orders. There were three consent orders announced recently in September 2024, October 2024, and the most recent one was an $8 million settlement against the Fairway Independent Mortgage Corporation, which was in Birmingham, Alabama. That was a redlining case. Unfortunately, though, we won't expect any current DOJ to continue combating redlining. So this is more local. In 2018, Klein Bank settled with the Department of Justice, resolving allegations of redlining in majority minority neighborhoods in and around the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. This lawsuit alleged that between 2010 and 2015, Klein Bank intentionally avoided lending services to communities based on race and national origin, and that violated the Fair Housing and Credit Opportunity Act. In the settlement, Klein Bank agreed to expand banking services into this previously neglected market, and they invested $300,000 in a loan subsidy. You can see it. This is a map of the case of the redlining when it was occurring. All this is to say that the CRA is making a difference in increasing access to capital. This slide shows a few examples of studies finding benefits flowing from the CRA. There has been some criticism of the CRA, but research has shown that the CRA eligible lending is not more risky than non-CRA covered lending, and these criticisms are not really backed up by any data. There are studies that found that even within the same bank, loans in CRA assessment areas are less prone to foreclosure than loans outside the assessment area. And that's my presentation. Thank you for listening to my introduction to CRA. Jason will now be contributing to part two of our presentation, where he'll be discussing the Minnesota markets.
Hi there, thanks, Nzinga. My name is Jason Richardson, and I'm the Director of Research at NCRC. Today, we're going to start off with a little bit on mortgage lending over the last few years in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And then I'm going to dive into a couple of interactive reports that show the link between modern day lending and redlining from the past. And mortgage lending is a great proxy for a large variety of different forms of investment. So I'm going to use that today to kind of show you how historical redlining still connects to economic investment and health outcomes today in redline communities. Let me share the first screen here. This is a look at mortgage lending in the city of Minneapolis over the last few years. And what you see here is home purchase lending from 2018, so pre-pandemic, through the pandemic time period, and then up until 2024. I want to talk about a couple of the patterns that I see here and tell you from looking at patterns across the country like this, where Minneapolis and St. Paul are different and where they kind of fit the pattern. So first and foremost, during the pandemic, as interest rates went down, we did see, generally speaking, an increase in loans to low to moderate income borrowers and in low to moderate income and majority minority census tracts. We don't really see that as much in Minneapolis, which is really curious. We don't see that increase. The low to moderate income borrowing was already a pretty significant portion of home purchases in Minneapolis, so that it may just have been there wasn't a whole lot of room for it to go up, to be perfectly honest with you. I do want to note that the increase you see in majority minority tract lending in 2022 probably has less to do with more loans going into minority neighborhoods than it does with a change in census boundaries, where we created hundreds of new census tracts with the 2020 census that took effect in 22, and a large number of them were majority minority, but middle and upper income primarily. If we look at race, this is the race of the borrower in the case of these home purchase loans. You'll notice the number of loans has changed because not every borrower reports race on their application. But we do see here two things that are very that we've seen across the country. First is the strong surge in lending to both Asian and Hispanic borrowers. They really have increased. We also see in Minneapolis, and this is somewhat idiosyncratic because we don't see such a strong surge in loans to Black home buyers. In most of the country, and I'm going to put some links in the chat later on, you can look at our mortgage market report showing that, generally speaking, across most metros, home purchase lending to Black borrowers has been relatively flat during this period. So I'd say that this is all a good sign for the most part for lending in Minneapolis. When we look at St. Paul, it's a slightly different story. First, we see the same pattern of an increase in lending during 2020 and 2021, but it wasn't quite as pronounced. And we've also got the increase in majority minority tract lending that didn't happen due to the boundary change. So that makes me think that there probably there weren't many boundary changes in St. Paul. And this is just confined to the city of St. Paul. We also see the same pattern of an increase in lending to Asian, Black, and Hispanic borrowers across the board, though. So, again, in both cases, I think that you've got a unique metro in some respects, where you see kind of the strong surge in lending to groups that were not necessarily the same as we've seen in cities across the country. All right, now that's a lot about data. Let's take a look at some interactive maps. And again, these are going to be linked to in the chat later on, so you will be able to go online and take a look at them yourself. The first thing we're going to take a look at is one of our reports on redlining and public health. And several years ago, we began working on an NIH grant with the University of Richmond and the University of Michigan, where they were focused on the health outcomes for people who had lived in redlined communities. And what we found it's been shocking in a lot of ways. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the city of Minneapolis. That is the original 1930 era redlining map. And if you've been around the redlining discussion at all, you've probably seen this kind of map. These were hand-drawn, mostly in the mid-30s. And if you zoom in here, you can see how they ranked neighborhoods. Green was best, blue was still desirable, yellow was definitely declining, and D was hazardous. If we zoom back out again, you can see what the city looked like at the time. Now, the areas that are not filled in, these gray areas, would have been business or industrial. So you notice that they're surrounded by redlined areas, mostly because you didn't want to live next to those kind of communities. And if you click on these, let's just pick one here. There we go. In the middle here, it has comments that were written by the examiner at the time in the 1930s. Now, they would have gathered this by going to the community, meeting with business leaders, city leaders, realtors, lenders, and so forth, almost all men, all white, and they would learn about these neighborhoods. And this area is redlined. Let's take a look and see why. It's older, many fine homes, occupied by Germans, French, and Scandinavians. That's never a good sign. Back at the time, anybody who wasn't born in the U.S., generally of English descent, wasn't going to be seen very well. They have a little bit more. They have, yes, they mentioned the presence of Jewish and yeah. So that was enough to get it redlined. And if you click on other areas, and here, for example, I'm clicking on an area to the south of what is today, I think, downtown. Again, you see the way they talked about the neighborhood. So there were a lot of reasons that could get you redlined. The presence of industrial facilities nearby was always one. The presence of anybody they considered non-American or immigrant was also. But there was a special place in the forms that they filled out, and a special place in the way that the examiners were trained that made sure they were looking for the presence of African Americans. Minneapolis had a lot of different people living there at the time, though. So when I go around and I look at some of these descriptions, I also see a lot of anti-immigrant bias. But the focus on African Americans is always there. I'm going to post some links later to some of the original scans that you can go to, and these are kind of amazing. You can look at the scans that were typed up in the 1930s that were preserved in the U.S. archives. And the way that they talk about the communities is is kind of shocking from a modern perspective. And at the time, it's difficult to think of this, but the people doing this really felt that they were doing something progressive, modern, scientific. And what they did was they created a system that essentially denied these areas investment. And after the HOLC ended, the Federal Housing Administration took the same methods and ran with them for about 30 years. That period set in stone this pattern of disinvestment, and in many cases, we still see today, or in most cases, formerly redline communities from the past today are lacking in investment, and we don't see as much mortgage lending there. We see concentrations of poverty and other health factors. Getting back to the health issue, and let's take a look here at this neighborhood. If we scroll down to the bottom, what you're seeing here and on the right, this map is looking at the social vulnerability of the communities. The Social Vulnerability Index is a CDC measurement, and it's used to assess whether or not a census tract is vulnerable to things like disease outbreak, natural disaster, or other type of event. Uh, the red areas there indicate that those communities are more vulnerable to events like COVID, for example, than the green communities. And what we find, you'll notice here, I'm going to click off of this for just a second. But if you look at the map on the left and on the right, you'll notice that there is generally kind of an alignment between neighborhoods that are red today in terms of social vulnerability and ones that were redlined or considered dangerously declining in the 1930s. And then let me see here. Greg wanted me to look at one of these. I think this was it. This neighborhood, for example, in the 1930s was redlined. And if we look down here, it has today one of the highest social vulnerabilities in the city. We go down a little bit further, it also has one of the highest minority populations, one of the lowest life expectancies. And by contrast, you have neighborhoods here that were green lined here we go. They're mostly over on the eastern side of the city. The life expectancy there is something like 89 and a half years. Meanwhile, in this neighborhood, it's 73 years. That's a stark difference in life expectancy. So you see that people are younger in this community. The average age is younger. There's a lower percentage of elderly people there. Poverty rate is high. It's not the highest in the city, but it's still very high. Almost a third of the population is in poverty. Asthma, one of the highest rates in the city. Cancer, one of the lower ones. Ironically, that's not a good sign because people aren't living long enough to get cancer. The fact is today that most of us at some point in our lives, or a lot of us, will get some form of cancer. But in this community, people don't live long enough, so you only see a small incidence of cancer. Diabetes, very high. High blood pressure, also on the high end. Kidney disease, mental health problems, obesity. You guys can take a look through this. Like I said, I'll post the link later on. You can take a look at your community and see what it looks like there. There's a map like this for St. Paul as well. Um, But in the interest of time, I want to go on and talk about mortgage lending and look at the interactive mortgage map also. Let me back out of this here a little bit, and we want to look at our, let's see, report here. Now, this was a report we did. Again, this is part of our work with NIH, and we were going to look at mortgage lending over the last 40 years compared to redlining activity. What you've got here is a little confusing at first, so let me explain. The redlining map that we just looked at, we translated that here. And those red areas, the red outlines you see here, are ones that were redlined in the map that we just looked at on the other screen. The gray dots you see are mortgage loans at the census tract level, spread across the entire metro area, including Minneapolis and St. Paul. This is from 1981. So in 1981, you actually had a pretty good distribution of lending. Some of the dots are smaller than others, and some of them are bigger, but they're generally pretty well spread out. If we can zoom in a little bit here, you can see even within the city, even when the areas like the purple areas here would have been 50% minority. Keep in mind, this is 1980 census time. So it was mostly a white majority city, but you do have islands here that were over 50% non-white. However, they still have lending going on in them. If we click on one of these here, it actually will show you a little bit more about it. It'll show that this was a D-rated or redlined community. It gives you the census tract information, and it shows that in 1981 they had 33 mortgage loan originations in that neighborhood, in compared to the area median of 24 loans per census tract. So they were getting, their fair share of mortgage loans at the time. 1981. Let's zoom forward a little bit here, and I'm going to stay zoomed into here, but you can go down to this little right-hand corner, and let's scoot forward a few years. And the first thing you're going to see is we get to a certain point here in 1991 with a new census. So the new census has detected an increase in minority population in the cities. So you've seen these areas now, you have the lighter purple, which are 50% or more non-white, and then you have the darker purple, which are 80% or more non-white. You notice that they are still clustered in areas that were redlined. That's not unusual. 70% of redlined communities from the 30s today are a majority minority and low income as well. What you'll notice, though, is there's still mortgage lending. It's moved around a little bit, though. You see some of these dots have moved here to the southwest, but you still have some activity throughout most of the city. Let's go forward a little bit. By the end of the 90s, we're starting to get into what became known as the housing boom period. And let's stop here around 2005. So what you've seen again is the growth of the minority population in the redlined areas of the cities. You see that with the new census, uh, uh, there's a lot more of the city is majority minority. What you'll also note is that the lending's gone from a lot of it. Yes, downtown, you've got a lot of activity. Here, we can take a look and see that by 2005, this downtown census tract was getting 515 loans per year compared to an average of 200. First of all, you'll notice how big that average is compared to the one we looked at earlier, right? Well, where are all the loans? So let's back out a little bit, and we can see that what happened was during this period, you had massive influx of investment in these exurban areas, we used to call them, which are suburbs that are a little farther out. And you see this ring of investment in communities around the city, and that's where your mortgage lending went to. It abandoned most of the city and it flowed out to these new areas. Within the city itself, even though you could see lending going on, it was at a much lower level. And generally speaking, we did see some lending coming into these communities, the high minority communities in '05, but it was nothing like the even spread that we saw at the beginning of this discussion, right? So let's go forward a couple of years. Everybody knows what happened in 2008 with the housing crash. We get to 2011, first of all, new census, many more minority areas. Those have expanded. And after the crash, you'll notice that lending has come back into the city, but not in those high minority or redline communities. You have a strong line of lending here around the southern end between the city and the airport. But in communities that are 50% or 80% minority, uh-uh, nothing. Lending even flows into these blue lined and green lined areas in the middle of the city. And if you zoom out, you can still see quite a bit of activity in the outlying areas. Now, this stays the same pretty much until today. If we go to 2021, which this particular map ends in 2021, we don't see a big change. We do see a moderate degree of lending. And actually, this isn't as bad as a lot of cities I look at. Generally speaking, when I look at this map for most cities, you really don't see much of anything, especially in an 80% minority neighborhood like this one. If we look here, the census tract was yellow lined in the 1930s. The bar chart here indicates the gray lines indicate the median origination number for the city that year, and then the line indicates the number that were in that particular census tract. Meanwhile, the bar chart at the bottom tells you more about the population. In this case, this was an area that was only 10% minority in 1980, and today it is over 80% minority. Now, I want you to take a look at the links we're going to place in the chat a little bit later. We do have other reports. The injustice of redlining is a great place to start if you want to learn more about this. And then the reports that I just teased here, the decades of disinvestment, they talk a lot more about the relationship between redlining and investment today. Now, I'm going to post those later, and I'm sure there's some questions, but for right now, I'm going to throw things over to Catherine Petras. She is our Director of Institutional Accountability, and she can talk about more about CRA. And thank you very much.
Catherine, you're muted.
Hi, everyone. My apologies. I hope you all can hear me now. I don't know if you can see me, but my camera is on, but at least you can hear me, and the slides are more interesting. So I will go ahead and get started. This portion of the presentation will be about how we approach researching banks, and I will give you some tools that you can use to look into some banks that are in your community. And then I will talk about some ways that you can engage and get involved in CRA in order to hold banks accountable and also improve investments in your community. I always like to start talking about CRA with a little history. Gail Sancada was the chair of the National People's Action Organization, and she was really instrumental in developing the CRA and getting it passed in the 70s. And she was a community organizer and worked with organizers. And this is a quote from her about CRA, that the full responsibility for CRA enforcement has always been the job of people in the neighborhoods. And the CRA does have embedded within the statute and how it works a lot of community engagement requirements and components that I'll talk about shortly. Why should you get involved? We think it's really important for communities to engage in CRA advocacy. It improves bank performance, increases resources for community development and for underserved neighborhoods, and it builds lasting partnerships and relationships with financial institutions. Banking is a relationship-driven business, so this is something NCRC views as a win-win for communities and banks. I'll pause here and let you all know these slides will be available after the webinar, and I will ask the hosts also to share my email. Please feel free to email me with questions. I always use these webinars as a chance to convey a lot of information. So some of these slides will have a lot of information, but you don't have to memorize it all. You'll have it after the webinar today, and I'm very happy to answer questions about CRA and anything we're discussing today after the presentation. So what is CRA enforcement? It really begins with research, using a lot of the tools that Jason just shared to understand lending performance is really important. Also, researching bank performance by reading CRA exams is important. I'll have a slide later on that will have links that you can use to download CRA exams. Understanding what a bank's assessment areas are, that just means the markets and the geographic areas where the bank has CRA obligations. It's basically anywhere you see a bank branch, they have a CRA obligation there. And then what CRA advocacy means, specifically, the two main tools that we use and that you all can use are writing comment letters and community benefits agreements. Going back to performance evaluations, they include a lot of information about banks and their performance in each of the markets that they serve. They also include what I think of as a report card and a rating. So every bank will get an overall rating, which is because of grade inflation, almost all banks get a passing grade, either satisfactory or outstanding. And occasionally banks will fail their CRA exam, and those ratings are needs to improve or substantial non-compliance. When you're looking at CRA exams, what I like to point people to is the appendix, which will have individual ratings for different service areas for each market that the bank is in. And you can scan the appendix to find, for example, this bank had a low satisfactory rating in Minnesota for the services test. Services looks at branch locations and volunteerism. That's a point of leverage you can use when you're talking or meeting with a bank, and they should be interested in learning from you how they can improve that rating. So look for low satisfactory scores in the appendix of CRA exams to find openings and opportunities to negotiate and pressure banks to improve performance in those areas. Now, public comment letters are, I think, really intimidating for some people, but to break it down, it's really a chance for you to share stories about your community, information about your organization, and that you're willing to partner with the bank to improve their performance. And usually it should or it could incorporate data analysis, which NCRC is happy to help provide to you. Really, data without your stories is not that compelling. So I really encourage people to get used to writing comment letters, and we have multiple templates that we can share with you. Once you do one or two, it becomes very easy. And we had one member in St. Louis tell me she started commenting on every bank merger that impacted her city. And she got the bank's attention and ended up getting a lot of resources for St. Louis because of her comments. And it was just her standard practice to look at merger activity and comment on every single merger that impacted her community. The three opportunities for public comment, and this is actually built into the CRA law itself, are during CRA performance evaluations, which takes place every 3 years. Unfortunately, under the current administration, that is being extended out to longer periods because they don't have enough staff. We've heard from several banks that their 2026 exams were postponed to 2027. And to me, that's just another point to underscore why it's so important for communities and organizations like yours and like NCRC to stay involved and make sure the banks know that we're paying attention, even when the regulators don't. The other opportunity for comment is during mergers and branch acquisitions. Banks hate merger comment letters. So if you let them know that you're preparing a comment, sometimes that will get them into a conversation with you. And that's often a great point, opportunity for leverage and for getting banks to the table to agree to commitments like a community benefits agreement or even more local market commitments for your organization. Another opportunity for comment, which we haven't found to be very effective, is when banks close branches, they have to post notice. There's a comment period, but the regulators are not permitted to, or they don't have the authority to prohibit a branch closure. So sometimes protesting a branch closure can result in the branch staying open a little longer, or the bank might redirect some different resources into the community, but generally it's not as effective as the comments on mergers or on CRA exams. So besides comment letters, the other main tool we use in CRA advocacy are community benefits agreements. These are public commitments to communities within the bank's footprint. From our perspective, they should always include goals to increase CRA eligible loans and investments over prior period performance and to increase LMI, low and moderate income community branch presence. Historically, we have also been successful in getting non-CRA commitments into community benefits agreements like supplier diversity or staff diversity commitments. That is probably not going to happen under the current administration, but should be something I will be hopeful will come back in the future. CBA commitments largely track how banks are examined under CRA. The top row of commitments here is pretty much how we structure all of our community benefits agreements. They have a section on mortgage goals, small business goals, community development loans and investments, branch goals, and philanthropy. And like I said before, we often have banks commit to staff diversity goals or supplier diversity goals. We actually have had conversations with several banks recently. They still have staff and supplier diversity goals. Some banks are taking those out of the public commitments, but we will keep asking and encourage you all to ask for those goals as well. So another plug for community benefits agreements and CRA advocacy is the move to digital banking is really limiting and reducing the number of branches in communities. And like we noted before, CRA obligations are based on branch locations, and that is the current law. There was, and Zinga mentioned, there was a 2023 CRA rule that had been finalized. And its intent was to modernize CRA to address this fact that a lot of banks are becoming more and more digital. That has been rescinded, and so we're back to the 1995 CRA rule. It's all based on where banks have branches. Community benefits agreements are really an opportunity to improve CRA investments and amplify the impact of CRA in communities as banks scale back on their branch presence. And some people ask, are CBAs required and why banks do them? The answer is they're not required, but a lot of banks engage in them in order to get merger approval or public support for mergers. And to be honest, we have a lot of really positive relationships with banks that had previous lending discrimination allegations or settlements that brought them to the table, either voluntarily or sometimes not voluntarily. But basically, the two opportunities, best opportunities to get a bank's attention to do a community benefits agreement are when they're merging and if they have a redlining settlement or lending discrimination issue. So this is about how this relates to you. What can you do as a next step? In this economy, in this environment, I think it's really a good time to focus on building relationships, focus on meeting bankers who are in your market, and find out, again, if they have a branch in your community, they have a CRA obligation there. So if you see a bank that you're interested in learning more about, go online, go on their website or onto LinkedIn and find some local market leaders and just reach out to them, ask for a meeting. The people you want to talk to are often CRA officers, or sometimes you'll see community loan officers, community engagement teams, or a corporate social responsibility group within a bank. Those are the local bankers that you want to connect with, and try to get them to a meeting, invite them to an event. Before the meeting, research the bank, use some of the tools Jason shared, and I will share some additional tools with you. And you'll have these slides afterwards. But find out some key details about the bank, like their footprint, and anything you can learn about their products and services can be helpful. And then during the meeting, as an initial meeting goal, your job is really just to learn about the banker and the bank that you're meeting with. So find out what their motivation is, what are their priorities, if it's an individual or several people, what are they passionate about personally? What are the bank's future strategies for growth? For example, some banks might be expanding small business lending. They might be contracting their small business lending. So it's really good to know what lines of business they're either growing or focusing on in the future, and then think about how your work and the community's needs overlap with the bank's priorities. And then one more thing about meeting with someone from a bank, always have a next step, whether it's another meeting, you've agreed to share contact information or connect the bank with someone else. Just always leave that meeting with something to follow up on. This is a very dense slide, but it's basically a tool for you all to use later. It has links to where you can get performance evaluations. And the one thing I will note on this slide, because I think we're going to move into questions in a moment, in the last section, there's a mention of the CRA public file. Banks will often put a CRA file on their website, and that is a great place to start researching a bank. It's where you can find performance evaluations, maps of their assessment areas, and links to public comments about the bank that have been submitted recently. So before I turn it over to Greg for questions, I just wanted to quickly mention NCRC membership is a great tool that can facilitate CRA advocacy. And I put up a little slide here about some other benefits of NCRC membership. We are going to have a very detailed Community Investment Institute available to members soon that will go into detail and depth on all the topics we covered today, and want to invite you all to our Just Economy Conference, which is our annual event, and next year will be April 13th through 15th in Washington, D.C. So that's all I've got for you today. I will now turn it back over to Greg for questions.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Jason, and thank you, Nzinga. That was a very thorough conversation on a whole slew of issues. I hope people have found that a bit edifying and illuminating as to how to engage with banks locally, what the Community Reinvestment Act is all about, CRA, and hopefully it demystified the process for you to a degree. What we wanted to be able to do was just sort of give you the basics and let you know about the history and how it came about as far as law and how the issues of the past, like redlining, are still impacting the Twin Cities today. Share with you our research capacity with Jason and his team, and share with you our added value that we could provide when it comes to giving you templates and ideas how to engage with banks with comment letters. Should they run afoul of the law or should they want to do a merger? So what we'd like to do now is open it up to questions. And the Q&A box, when I click on it, I don't see any. One of the questions people often have is, how do I get involved? Well, the first thing I'd recommend is that you reach out to Deborah. She's been a long time colleague of mine as far as she's engaged in listening sessions when we do the preliminary work for a community benefit agreement. She's been to our conference in DC, and she knows what it's like to get involved. So I would first recommend that you chat with Deborah and ask her what it's all about. So Deborah, would you like to chat for a bit?
You know what, Greg, I thank you for that. And I have to tell you, when I was with your team, I absolutely learned so much. And I was so excited to bring this to Minnesota. But one of the things I wanted to ask, and I think I'd like to have you share with everyone, is if I contacted NCRC, I'm a member, and I want to approach a financial institution, a bank, how would you help me walk into that discussion from a position of power? How would you assist me with information I need so that I'm able to share with them that I understand their footprint, I understand where they'd like to go, and this is how I can assist them with doing that.
So I think that's a good question. I think part of that was addressed in some of Catherine's presentation. Just as an organizer, being familiar with the bank, what it does in your community or what it has done in the past and maybe doing differently now from your lived experience is a good place to start. Aside from reaching out to Deborah, were you to be a member, you'd probably reach out to our team to say, look, we want to engage this bank. Do you guys have good information on them? And Catherine, would you like to give the sort of steps 1, 2, 3 again as to how you think folks who are interested in engaging a bank or establishing a relationship with a bank, what they should do? Because often it's relationship building, right, Catherine?
Yes, it starts with building a relationship. And Deborah, to reiterate what Greg said, I think it is really important to go into meetings like that with information, armed with data and information, especially weaknesses that our research may have identified in bank performance, or a weakness that is noted in their CRA exam, an area where they got a low satisfactory. Because the people we work with within banks, CRA staff within banks, they do care. I view them as our allies within the bank, and it's up to us to give them the tools they need to advocate internally at the bank to increase reinvestment and to improve performance. So I hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does.
Yes.
Uh,
So, and real quick, I think the data and the analysis that we can provide is super helpful. But I think what you have to understand, and I think is treat everybody like a human being. The CRA officers are like a constituent service person for a congressman's office. Often CRA officers come from the nonprofit field. And so you'll end up often encountering someone who's a kindred spirit. He or she will care about affordable housing, care about workforce development, care about the reputation of the bank. They'll be proud of something that they're engaged in. And so, to circle back to what Catherine said in her presentation, um, when you first start encountering or working with the bank or reaching out to the bank, you want to find out who that CRA officer is. You want to find out what he or she priorities are, what they really care about, because you may find some synergies right off the bat. And then after you have that meeting, invite them to your facility, invite them to your nonprofit, show them around. So when they're doing an activity, they'll remember that, oh yeah, Deborah Hurston's shop does this. They created that online credit union, or this organization does this type of financial literacy. So it's establishing that social capital and cultural competency that you need to have with them and they need to have with you. So I'm going to look at some of these questions now in the chat, and I'm encouraging people to do use the Q&A box, but I'm looking at,
Greg, there's one other question.
go
I,
ahead.
I saw if I could address that. Someone asked about the time frame between an
That's what I
initial
was going to do. Yeah.
meeting and asking for something. Um, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. I will just say that this work is a marathon and it's not a sprint. So we have had really successful relationships with some banks that took years to develop. So, um, I wouldn't discourage anyone from asking for philanthropy or loans or investments very quickly. But I would say if you get a no or you get put off, don't give up, but maintain that relationship and keep it going for years. Think
And
of it as like
yeah,
a
no, it's
years long relationship process.
because sometimes a bank is in the midst of being evaluated for their CRA performance. And sometimes your timing may be perfect, where they've been wanting to improve in something, they just haven't been able to do it yet. So it's like winning the lotto, like something may happen right away. But often, as Catherine said, it's a years long process. It's relationship building. It's being equipped with good data and good information. And always consider that CRA officer to be someone that cares about your community. Now, in some areas, you may have a circumstance where that bank has a headquarters in another state or another city. So sometimes that CRA officer isn't able to be as proactive as he or she would want, doesn't have like the agency or freedom to do some of the things that he or she would want. So you have to sort of have an understanding as to where the decisions are being made, out of Chicago, out of New York, out of Charlotte. So they may have some administrative hindrances to them being as dynamic or quick to pivot and turn and help as you would want. But again, it's establishing a relationship and moving on from there. Without seeing any further questions, um, I think now would be the time for us to wrap up, if that's okay, Deborah. And I just wanted to thank ABEP for hosting this event. I want to thank my colleagues Jason and Zinga and Catherine for walking through CRA 101 and going through the variety of elements that NCRC can bring to the table when it comes to research, when it comes to data and analysis and CBA. And I think, Sharon, you will have the final word.
That was such an informative session. And ABEP would like to give a big thank you to Greg and the entire NCRC team for sharing this valuable information. We also appreciate our sponsors, Old National Bank, for their support and their commitment to community education. Lastly, thank you for attending. Your engagement helps strengthen the work that we're all doing together. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at future ABAP Financial Empowerment Center programs. Thank you all.